I get asked many times how I go about designing my whole cloth quilts. I'm hoping this little video will give you a step into my imagination so that you can see what steps I take to design them. In my quilt, Time to Smell the Roses, it all started with this stencil from the Stencil company. It's a 16.5-inch stencil called Cameo. The reason I wanted to design this quilt was to celebrate my retirement and my 70th birthday. So I thought it's certainly time now to smell the roses. So the first thing I did was try to find an embroidery pattern with a rose in it. And this is the one I found from Embroidery Library. It's a toile design, which means it doesn't have a lot of stitches in it, which is exactly what I was looking for. But the rose wasn't quite what I wanted, so I had to take it into my software and do a little modification until I got what I was looking for. As you can see, I concentrated on the top rows and removed the other ones. I also removed the 3 leaves on the left-hand side and left just the 1 leaf for this design. I also shortened the stem just a little bit and mirror imaged the rose to straighten it up a little bit so that it would fit within the framework of my stencil. Once I found my first 2 main elements, the stencil and the rose, I went ahead and marked the stencil on my fabric. It was a 45-inch square of Kona cotton. After I marked it, I then embroidered all the roses in the Cameo sections. I forgot to add when I marked my stencil, I did that on a 45-degree angle because I really like the looks of a medallion on the diagonal. I really wanted these roses to pop up since this was the theme of my quilt, and I always work with a theme. So I decided to use trapunto in the Cameo sections surrounding the rose. So that was my next step, to add my first layer of batting. After stitching around this Cameo section, I carefully trimmed the excess batting before proceeding. After that, I sandwiched the entire piece with my backing and my regular batting and stitched everything together along the lines of the stencil. Now, keeping with the original theme, which was celebrating a retirement and a 70th birthday, I had done the roses in gold to indicate the golden years. Now I needed something to indicate time, so I decided to do all the stitching around the stencil and the rose with tiny circles to represent the sands of time. What was accomplished by doing this, not only am I getting the symbolism that I was after, but I also managed to push the batting down surrounding those areas and allowing the rest of it to puff up. At this stage of the game, this is what the quilt looks like. The center's pretty, but we certainly need to do something with the outside where all the safety pins are. So how about an outer border? Maybe instead of on the diagonal, we'll just make it a square border, and I happen to have this one in my stash. I don't like all the little leaves and the little buds coming off of this, so we'll eliminate that and mark the stencil and get ready to stitch it. So here is our border all stitched, and you'll notice it's also stitched in the light gold to make it pop up a little bit. And I wanted something to signify happiness and freedom. I'm not working anymore. Isn't this delightful? So I decided to do a bunch of dancing feathers in the corners to fill that out. I also set off each section with 2 rows of parallel stitching to define each of the sections. And I think that makes a big difference. The quilt still needed a little bit more because I wanted it to be a little larger than it was after I put the outer border on. So I saw a design similar to this on Pinterest and I really liked it. Now I have a silhouette Cameo that I use for making my own stencils. The beauty of that is I can make those stencils to fit whatever I need it to fit. I also was able to take it into CorelDRAW, which is a program I use a lot, and notice that if I put those stencils at a 90-degree angle, it created a crosshatch grid in the corners. I really like that too. Now for those of you who do have a silhouette Cameo, you might be scratching your head wondering how you can create a stencil. If you take that design into your software, and you'll see the circles where I've taken the eraser and I've broken up the lines, because if you don't do that, you'll just end up with a mess. You have to break apart the lines like on a real stencil. And this is what I end up with. Again, the beauty of this is I can create whatever size I need. And not leaving anything to chances, the next thing I do is take a bunch of copy paper together and I draw out these stencils on that paper and lay it against my quilt to make sure that it will indeed fit. Once I'm satisfied that the fit is going to be exact, I go ahead and cut out my stencil and mark that as I always do. And now my quilt is really coming together. I've got the center motif in the center that's diagonal. I've got the dancing feathers in the corner. I've got an inner border with cables and flowers. And I have my outer border that was made to fit. All that's left is a few finishing touches. One of those finishing touches was a very fine cording that I added to my binding, also in the same gold as the other stitching was done in. That really helped to set off this all-white quilt. The final touch was to add half pearls to the center of each of the flowers on the inner border. The pearls symbolize wisdom on this quilt. So there is a lot of symbolism and a lot of love that went into this quilt, and it's probably one of my very favorites. The quilt is finished now and proudly hanging in my sewing room to commemorate my retirement and birthday. It also represents another milestone. I was fortunate enough to win in the Mid-Atlantic Quilting Show competition, Best Sewing Machine Workmanship. What an honor that was. So there you have it, folks. It's a little step inside my brain, which can be a little scary, to find out how I imagine and plan out quilts. I hope you've enjoyed this.